Hello, good evening, and welcome to our third Aria series with Mission Opera and Exploration Music Project. My name is Dr. Joshua Wentz. I'm the executive and artistic director of Mission Opera, and we were so pleased to have you join us this evening for our presentation of Ambroise Thomas's Hamlet, the beautiful baritone aria Comme, pále, fleur, sung by baritone Joel Balzun. Thanks for joining us tonight. Before we begin, we talk a little bit about this aria, this music, this composer and the opera and the context for which it's set and how we ended up getting to the setting we have today. It's important to know what was going on in the 1860s in France when our composer wrote this beautiful show. Ambroise Thomas is only really known as an opera composer and somewhat of a sacred music composer. He taught at the Conservatoire de Paris for many decades and was a student there. But his two main operas that we know are Hamlet, of course, and Mignon. In France in the 1860s, we're coming out of what was known as the Second Empire. That is the Napoleon's nephew. Napoleon takes over, and there's a lot of contention. They had a lack of strong leadership for many years, which helped win the election of Napoleon III. And it really was at the point where they enabled him to rule with unrestricted personal authority. So much like his famous uncle, there was a lot of appointments and things going on. During this time, you're at the height of the Romantic era in music. You have realism throughout literature and art and painting. And you have opera as a genre at probably the height of its popularity in Europe with the great bel canto masterpieces and composers. Although Thomas was not known very well, he was known as a respected composer and leader and academic. Thomas was a student at the Conservatoire de Paris. He won the top prize in music, the famed Prix de Rome. And even though he spent his lifetime, his career composing operas and composing both sacred and secular music, probably his claim to fame was as an academic. He succeeded Daniel Aubert as the director of the conservatory and spent a long time working there. Now, just like the political structure that was happening in Europe, there was a lot of contention and fighting between composers as well. So as the professor and leader at the conservatoire, he was trying to attempt to prevent composers like César Franck and Gabriel Fauré from getting in as teachers and influencing the students. Right? They were all this traditional French music and belief, and they didn't like the fact that there was new avant-garde ideas happening and music changing. He was not able to inhibit or restrict Franck from entering, and Franck was hired in the conservatoire. But interestingly enough, the famous chanson composer that everybody sings music from in undergrad years, Gabriel Fauré, was sort of ousted and was never able, partly because of Thomas's work.
Did you know that there were over 20,000 musical compositions that were inspired by William Shakespeare? And of his 37 plays that he wrote, 300 different operas were written. This happened and started about 200 years later. See, Shakespeare died in 1616, and it wasn't until about 1816 that Rossini, the composer that's famous for many operas, including Figaro, 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 The Barber of Seville, Anyway, he was very famous. He wrote Othello the play by Shakespeare, and he took his Othello around the world, at least the European part, and that inspired Italians and Germans and French to write operas on Shakespeare. Bellini's The Capulets and the Montagues, or Gounod's Romeo and Juliet, to say nothing of Bernstein's West Side Story. Composers found compelling dramatic material in Shakespeare's plays, and also they were no dummies about marketing, because they knew if they were going to make their compositions after a play by Shakespeare, that would sell a lot more tickets. Of all the Shakespeare's plays that had been put to operas, Falstaff was the play that was most often turned into an opera. Verdi was the most prolific composer of Shakespeare's plays, and so he wrote Falstaff, and he wrote Othello, and he wrote Macbeth. There were many difficulties for composers to make an opera out of a Shakespearean play, and a lot of composers tried. For example, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Debussy. They all tried and were not able to complete an opera based on the Shakespearean play for three reasons mainly. Too many words Shakespeare had, too many characters he had, too many subplots he had, and there were few possibilities for dance opportunities or for ensembles. For example, choruses, or having 3 or 4 people speak and sing at the same time. Also, the arias were much more inside, much more like soliloquies. They weren't quite as rousing. They were exploring the characters' minds. So Hamlet, the opera that Ambroise Thomas decided to compose to music, is the longest play that Shakespeare ever wrote. It had 29,551 words. And Hamlet had the most lines of any Shakespearean character. So Shakespeare got the idea partly from a 13th century legend. And then there was somebody who wrote a little play called Hamlet. And then Shakespeare said, I'm going to write my own Hamlet. And he did. And Ambroise Thomas said, that's the one for me to write.
We find Hamlet in a cemetery, as called in the score, in Act 5, singing a lament to Ophelia. This lament is the beautiful aria, Comme, fleur. This music is beautiful. This music is traditional, classic French, in an era where they had a hard time letting go of the classical traditionalists past, but everyone was coming in and challenging how they should make music and what would be new and unique. The formal conventions of 19th century grand opera in Paris were more or less inflexible. And Thomas was one of the composers that really stuck with originality. The orchestral writing in this is gorgeous and highlights these great solo melodic lines. It's also insightfully dramatic. While we did not use a piano or orchestra for this track, and it is sung a cappella, you're able to hear the sounds of the environment of the cemetery and the pain and calling out in Hamlet's voice that makes this a true dramatic point for the entire character development in the entire opera.
The Hamlet by Thomas is an opera which, like a lot of French wines, does not travel well. Hamlet is not a version of our best self, let alone our authentic humanity. but what is worst and most selfish in us. His failure of commitment, his radical inhibition, his suicidal melodrama, and his violent misanthropic and misogynistic cruelty are some of the rather unappealing aspects of ourselves. Shakespeare forces us to stare at that which we do not want to look.
Since this aria is in French, we will provide an English translation. Like a pale flower, it closed at the breath of the grave. Under the blows of misfortune, sad and broken, it succumbs. By my cruel refusal, his soul forever desolate aspires only to heaven, whereas reason is vanished. From my fatal destiny, she suffers the law with pain. Who is she? We know, Ophelia. Ophelia, he cries to Ophelia, alas, forgive me. But who walks in the shadows? This is a great setting for a graveyard and mausoleum. I hope you enjoy. Joel Balzun singing Comme, pále, fleur.
Horatio, c'est vil pas médecin. J'ai pu les digérer sans que je les oublie. Je n'ai rien oublié. Non. Ah, même mourir. Pauvre enfant. Oh, l'amour, comme un fatal poison, a flétri la jeunesse et troublé la raison. Comme une pâle fleur éclose au souffle de la tombe, sous les coups du malheur, ton cœur brisé, tremblé, succombe. Le mot de sa fatale Dieu t'impose la loi. Hélas, pardonne-moi. Par mort vie cruelle, ton âme a jamais désolé. N'aspire plus qu'au ciel où ta raison c'est ta folie. Hélas, pardonne-moi, hélas, pardonne-moi, vois mes larmes. J'ai